This voice is artificial, but the ideas are real. Welcome to AI Podcast. Now, let's begin.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take a stack of challenging sources and really try to build a unified narrative out of what is, more often than not, fragmented and contradictory information.
And today we're staring down one of the most audacious claims in all of true crime history.
It really is. The claim is that the person responsible for this surgical, precise, almost clinical, unsolved murder in Los Angeles history is the same person who terrorized Northern California 2 decades later.
With costumes and shootings and cryptic ciphers, just the two couldn't seem farther apart.
Right. We are talking about bridging the gap between the Black Dahlia Elizabeth Short, whose murder just shocked the nation in 1947, and the Zodiac Killer,
whose confirmed attacks began in 1968, running through 69 and, potentially beyond. It's an intellectual leap of faith, to put it mildly.
Yes.
Because on the surface, the methodologies, the killer's signature, they're almost impossibly different. How does a perpetrator who uses surgical tools evolve into one who uses guns and, excessive stabbing?
That is the core tension we are diving into. Our mission today is to unpack the specific evidence that supports 2 primary and competing theories.
And both of these theories name a different suspect.
Exactly. One's a highly respected doctor, the other a former Navy corpsman. But both theories are trying to prove that one dark identity could sustain and even evolve its violence across 2 different decades.
And 2 major geographic regions, no less.
What makes this deep dive so challenging, and frankly so intriguing, is the specificity of the claims. We're not just relying on, loose circumstantial details here.
Not at all. The sources suggest connections rooted in these really high-level intellectual disciplines. We're talking about surrealist art theory, psychological analysis of murder as an aesthetic act.
And then you have highly technical World War II-era cryptography.
And even esoteric language claims about the ciphers. So we have to approach this with some intense scrutiny, because these theories really stand or fall on their granular details.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to start at the horrific starting point. The crime that launched the entire Black Dahlia myth and really set a psychological signature for a killer operating in that post-war era.
Let's start with 1947 Los Angeles. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She's often described as an aspiring actress, but she mostly worked as a waitress, living a pretty transient life around Southern California.
And she was last seen alive on January 9th.
Exactly. Her body was discovered 6 days later on January 15th in 1947. It was in a vacant, overgrown lot in a neighborhood called Limerick Park.
The discovery itself was instantly sensational, not just because of the public location, but because of the condition of the body. You said the crime was clinical. Can we define that for the listener?
Yeah, that's the key word. The sources just keep emphasizing the extreme, almost calculated nature of the mutilation. Her body was completely bisected, cut clean in half.
It's completely in half.
Completely. And the cut was incredibly precise.
Well,
it passed through the lumbar spine, right between the 2nd and 3rd vertebrae. This technique, medically, it resembles something called a hemicorporectomy.
Okay, that term, hemicorporectomy, that's key, isn't it? Because it implies a certain level of expertise.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
A hemicorporectomy is this radical surgical procedure where the body is literally transected. It's used in extremely rare medical cases. The chief medical coroner at the time, Dr. Frederick Newbar, he noted this wasn't just some clumsy dismemberment.
Right.
The bisection was clean. It severed the intestine precisely at the duodenum. And there was very little bruising around the incision line, which suggests the act was performed post-mortem, after she was already dead.
Which speaks to a killer with, what? Formal medical training? Or just extensive knowledge of anatomy?
And extreme self-control, either way. It's chilling.
And the surgical quality wasn't just limited to the bisection, right? The killer inflicted other injuries that were clearly designed to be memorable, to create a shocking image.
That's where the facial injuries come in. The killer created these deep, symmetrical lacerations extending outward from the corners of her lips.
The so-called Glasgow smile.
Exactly. 3 inches on the right side, 2.5 on the left. And the autopsy actually determined that the cause of death was likely hemorrhaging from those facial cuts, combined with the shock from several blows to the head.
So what we have is a crime defined by this cold anatomical precision, and it's designed for display. The body was completely drained of blood.
Meticulously washed.
Yeah.
Most likely to remove any trace evidence.
And then posed. Face up, arms raised above her head, legs spread. It was an object lesson in violence.
The deliberate staging is what changes this from just a murder case to a psychological puzzle. The goal was not concealment.
No.
The goal was notoriety. The offender laid Short out perfectly, ensuring she would be discovered and that the scene would convey the absolute maximum amount of shock. This intent, this need for public presentation, is such a critical piece of the 1947 signature.
And the public definitely got the message. The media ran with it, instantly turning Elizabeth Short into the infamous Black Dahlia. But the sources also highlight how destructive that media frenzy was, especially for her family.
It's a truly grim example of journalistic malpractice. The Los Angeles Examiner, they were desperate for personal details, so they contacted Short's mother, Phoebe, who lived in Boston.
And what they did was just unbelievable.
The reporter, Wayne Sutton, deliberately lied to her. He claimed Elizabeth had won a beauty contest, and he needed background information. Only after he extracted all those private details did he tell her that her daughter had been murdered.
That calculated deception, it just shows that the victim was already being turned into a commodity for sale. And that frenzy established these false narratives that have persisted ever since, often focusing on her morality or some kind of perceived deviance.
Exactly. I mean, one rumor that became part of the enduring myth claimed that Short was incapable of having sexual intercourse due to a congenital defect, something often cited as infantile genitalia.
And that just fueled so much speculation.
It did. But the official autopsy records, they definitively debunk this. While the medical examiner did note her uterus was small, her reproductive organs were otherwise anatomically normal.
And the claims that she was pregnant?
Also proven false by the autopsy. She was not pregnant. She hadn't recently had a botched abortion. All of that was media sensationalism.
It's so important to state those facts clearly because the killer's pathology gets overlaid with these societal judgments about the victim. It happens so often in these early high-profile female murder cases.
It really does.
But let's zoom out a bit to the broader context. LAPD investigators in 1947, they didn't see this as an isolated incident, did they?
No, they didn't. They immediately saw a pattern. Detectives compiled what they called the 11 points of similarity that linked Short's killing to other lone woman murders happening in the post-war LA area.
Victims like Jean French, Evelyn Winters,
And Gladys Kern, among others, yes.
So what were these points? Were they about the violence itself or the types of victims?
A bit of both, really. The list included shared characteristics. You know, the victims often frequented bars. They were typically slugged on the head, killed somewhere else, transported by car.
And then displayed.
Displayed, nude or nearly nude, without any effort at concealment. And crucially, the police concluded that the killings were pathological and motiveless. This established, years before the term serial killer was even widely used, a clear context for a highly organized mobile predator operating in the 1940s.
And the communication aspect, that was part of it too, right?
A huge part. The sources mention a specific signature for many of these associated crimes. In 6 of the 9 lone woman murders the police connected, the killer sent or left a taunting note for the authorities.
That is extremely rare.
It is. That habit of communicating and performing for the police. You'd previously only seen it in cases as far back as, like, Jack the Ripper.
So the foundation is set. A cold, surgical killer with a need for public display and communication in 1947. Now we have to leap across 2 decades to the chaotic, cryptographic Zodiac.
And the first theory, trying to bridge this massive gap, centers on a doctor who believed murder was a form of fine art, Dr. George Hodel.
The Hodel theory. It's advanced primarily by his son, Steve Hodel, who was a retired LAPD homicide detective. That gives it a kind of unusual institutional weight, doesn't it?
It really does. And the theory proposes that the Black Dahlia murder was specifically an act of murder as a fine art, rooted in Hodel's high-level intellectual and artistic circles.
So before we dive into the art, let's establish Hodel's connection to the crime and the investigation. Was he always a suspect?
He was definitely central to the police investigation. Steve Hodel's research, it uncovered these secret district attorney or DA files from 1949 and 1950.
And what did they say?
These documents confirm that George Hodel was the prime suspect in Short's murder. And significantly, this wasn't his only suspicious connection. He was also under investigation for the 1945 barbiturate overdose death of his secretary, Ruth Spaulding.
So there's a documented history of him being associated with sudden suspicious death in his immediate circle years before the Dahlia murder.
Exactly.
Okay, let's get to the artistic signature. This is where the theory becomes compellingly strange. It all hinges on surrealism and who his friends were.
Yes. Dr. Hodel was very closely connected to the avant-garde art world in Los Angeles. He was personal friends with the celebrated surrealist artist Man Ray during the decade Man Ray spent in Hollywood. So that's roughly 1940 to 1951. They moved in the same wealthy bohemian circles.
And the specific claim is that the murder was a replication of a Man Ray artwork.
Precisely. The theory argues that the posed, bisected body of Elizabeth Short was a direct, literal mimicry of Man Ray's photograph, Minotaur, which was created between 1934 and 1935.
And what does that photograph show?
It depicts a nude female torso and lower body, presented dramatically cut in half. It's often associated with themes of fragmentation and violence that were really popular in the surrealist movement.
And Hodel would have known this work.
The sources are pretty clear that Man Ray's work was displayed publicly, and his friendship with Hodel was intimate enough that Man Ray personally inscribed a self-portrait to Hodel and his wife in 1946, just a year before the murder.
Wait, let me just pause you there. If this is true, the implication is massive. This wasn't a crime of passion or convenience. This was deliberate aestheticization.
That's it.
Hodel would have been viewing the murder itself as a piece of performance art, a highbrow critique.
That's the psychological insight the theory provides. It shifts the motivation from simple rage to an act of intellectualized creation. The killer isn't hiding their brutality, they're elevating it, presenting it as a statement to be recognized by a select few.
Namely, other high art connoisseurs.
Exactly. And this elevation explains the draining of the blood, the cleaning of the body, the meticulous posing. It was all preparation for display, not just disposal.
And the physical setting Hodel lived in only deepens that bizarre theatrical flair. He lived in the Sowden House.
He did. The Sowden House is this iconic piece of LA architecture, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. in a Mayan temple revival style. It's monumental, it's dark, and it's highly theatrical.
Why does the architecture matter, though? Is it just a weird coincidence?
I think it fits the profile. Hodel lived there from 1945 to 1950. So, living in a structure that already felt like a stage set, this strange ancient temple in the middle of Hollywood, it just lends credence to the idea that Hodel viewed his life, and potentially his acts, through a lens of grand, dark drama.
The house itself has been used as a backdrop in films.
Many films,
Yeah.
including LA Confidential, precisely because of its sinister aesthetic potential.
So beyond the art, there are these local connections that tie Hodel directly to the logistics of the Short Order.
The geography is tight. Elizabeth Short was last seen leaving the Biltmore Hotel downtown on January 9th. Dr. George Hodel's medical office was in the Roosevelt Building, which is just 350 yards away.
3 football fields.
Basically, yeah. A very short walk.
And that proximity is key when we start talking about the communications sent by the killer.
Absolutely. The killer, who called himself the Black Dahlia Avenger, mailed several notes to the Los Angeles Examiner. And crucially, the note that read, "Turning myself in on January 29th.
Which an expert said was Hodel's handwriting.
An independent handwriting expert claimed it was written in Hodel's undisguised hand, yes. And that note was mailed from a mailbox located directly across the street from the Biltmore Hotel.
So within 300 yards of Hodel's medical office.
And not just that. The killer used the exact same mailbox for a note associated with the Gladys Kern murder a year later.
That is a highly specific overlap. The killer is returning to the same small geographic point of origin to communicate with the press. Now, what about the actual sighting of a vehicle near the dump site?
That evidence comes from a resident named Robert Meyer. He reported seeing a vehicle parked at the exact spot in Leimert Park where Short's body was later found.
And he described it.
He described it as a 1936 or 1937 Ford sedan, black in color, parked there between 6:30 and 7 a.m. on January 15th, 1947.
In Hodel.
When you review the DA surveillance logs from 1950, investigators confirmed George Hodel owned and regularly drove a black 1936 Ford sedan during that precise period. The timeline is plausible. The body was discovered around 10:50 a.m., and rigor mortis hadn't fully set in, which fits an early morning disposal.
So we have the art, the architecture, the geography, and the vehicle.
Yeah.
Now for the biggest hurdle, the 2-decade time jump in the transition from surgical killer to Zodiac. How does the Hodel theory even begin to bridge that?
The theory is that Hodel's core impulse, the need to use violence as a form of artistic expression, it just evolved. He moved from mimicking visual art like Man Ray's photo to mimicking literature and film.
So the killer isn't bound by a single medium, but by this intellectual framework where life imitates dark, violent art.
That's the idea.
Can you give us an example of that early evolution even before Zodiac?
The theory points to the 1943 Ora Murray murder, the White Gardenia murder. The claim is that this killing was an imitation of a Cornell Woolrich radio play, The White Rose Murders, which had aired just 20 days prior.
And what's the connection?
Woolrich's fictional strangler left a white rose on the victim. In the Murray case, the killer allegedly left a white gardenia.
So the pattern is established early on. The killer reads or hears a piece of dramatic, violent fiction and then tries to manifest it in reality.
Precisely, and this ties directly into the Zodiac Killer's signature move. The Zodiac's letters consistently reference the short story, The Most Dangerous Game.
About a psychopath who hunts humans for sport.
General Zaroff, yes, believing man to be the most dangerous animal of all to kill.
And how does Hodel link back to that specific piece of literature?
The connection lies in the performance history. The source material notes that The Most Dangerous Game was performed as a radio play at the same CBS theater Hodel was familiar with in the 1940s, and it featured Orson Welles.
So the theory is that the Zodiac, with his theatrical hood and his crosshair symbol, was just acting out the role of General Zaroff. He's hunting game, continuing the pattern Hodel had established decades earlier.
Using mass media as a blueprint for murder.
Exactly. And finally, the cryptographic claim that supposedly embeds Hodel's name into the Zodiac's work.
This is a complex, high-level claim. The theory alleges that the name Hodel was later discovered concealed within a Zodiac cipher using the Ogham language.
We have to unpack that. What exactly is Ogham?
Ogham is an ancient alphabet. It's a very esoteric system of writing that was primarily used in early medieval Ireland and Britain. It's highly stylized, often using strokes or notches along a central line.
So the claim here is that the killer, this intellectual, high-minded artist, used a system far removed from standard modern English.
An esoteric system that would require a deep, specialized knowledge of history or cryptography, all to hide his name within his famous codes.
It reinforces the image of George Hodel as the unifying force, the ultimate master artist, who shifted his medium from surrealism to esoteric codes and pulp fiction, always ensuring his crimes were intellectual statements. That theory, resting on artistic evolution and esoteric language, it's extraordinarily detailed. But now we have a competing theory that bridges the exact same 2 decades, using a completely different suspect and relying instead on pure cryptographic data.
Right. Let's turn our attention to Marvin Margolis, who also went by Marty Merrill.
The Margolis theory is much more recent, and it relies on a handful of deeply personal and technical pieces of evidence. They contrast so sharply with the artistic theory of Hodel.
And I think the core difference is the link to Elizabeth Short herself. Margolis didn't rely on proximity to an office or a shared artistic circle. He reportedly lived with Elizabeth Short for 3 months in the 1940s.
So this suspect had a direct, personal, documented relationship with the victim right before her death. That changes the entire psychological landscape from an artistic obsession to a personal one. So how did this man come to be linked to the Zodiac 20 years later?
The initial link emerged decades after Short's death, near the end of Margolis's own life. In 1992, a year before he died from terminal cancer, he drew a sketch.
A sketch that's been interpreted as deathbed confession.
That's right.
What specifically was in this sketch?
It was done in black ink, and it depicts a nude female upper body against a dark background. The details are disturbing because they so closely resemble the unique injuries inflicted on Elizabeth Short.
How so?
The torso appears cut off above the navel, similar to the bisection. One of the nipples seems dissected. It was signed Marty Merrill 92, and the name Elizabeth was clearly written right below the figure.
A visual representation of the Dahlia's unique injuries signed by him and featuring her name. That is a stunning piece of direct, nonverbal admission.
And this is where the theory takes an even more technical turn. When the sketch was analyzed further using image enhancement software,
Yes.
the hidden word Zodiac was allegedly uncovered beneath the heavy ink shading,
Well,
which suggests that in his final year, Margolis was confessing to being both the perpetrator of the Dahlia murder and the Zodiac attacks, confirming the unity of the identity.
okay, now let's move to what many see as the most persuasive part of the Margolis theory, the cryptography. This revolves around the Z13 cipher.
One of the famous unsolved codes the Zodiac Killer sent to the police. The Z13 is short, and it's notoriously difficult. But the solution proposed by independent investigators gained substantial traction
Why?
because it was subsequently endorsed by a high-level cryptography team. And this team included Ed Giorgio, a former chief codemaker for the National Security Agency, the NSA.
The NSA is the ultimate authority on code making and code breaking, so why is Giorgio's endorsement of this particular solution so significant?
Because the NSA doesn't just lightly endorse solutions presented by private citizens. Giorgio's involvement suggests that the method used to solve the Z13 was sound, that it utilized period-appropriate encryption techniques.
The explosive detail.
The explosive detail is that the solution was so compelling because the key word used to generate the Z13 cipher, the essential element that unlocks the entire code, was the name Elizabeth.
The victim's first name was the key to the killer's most personal code 20 years later.
Exactly. For a short cipher like Z13, mathematically there are hundreds, maybe thousands, of potential solutions. The likelihood of a correct solution aligning perfectly with a known, period-accurate encryption method and relying on a key word directly relevant to the suspect and the Black Dahlia victim's first name.
The odds have to be astronomical.
Cryptographers describe it as vanishingly small. It acts as an incredibly potent mathematical confession.
This immediately raises the question, though. How would Marvin Margolis, a surgical student and a WWII Navy corpsman, have the background to construct a high-level, complex encryption puzzle like the Z13? That kind of knowledge is highly specialized.
And that gap is addressed by one critical detail from his life in the 1940s. While Margolis himself was a corpsman, a medical specialist, his roommate during the period leading up to the Black Dahlia murder
Let me guess.
was a WWII Signal Corps cryptographer.
Yeah, it is.
This connection provides a very plausible, specific source for the advanced knowledge needed to construct the Z13 cipher using the keyword Elizabeth.
It's the perfect narrative closure, isn't it? The access to surgical knowledge for the 1947 murder and access to advanced cryptography for the 1968 codes.
And his age fits the profile perfectly, too. Margolis was in his early 20s during the Black Dahlia murder, which would put him in his early 40s during the Zodiac attacks. That aligns neatly with witness descriptions of the Zodiac as a middle-aged man.
So we are presented with two highly detailed specific theories linking two different men to both crimes. George Hodel via art and literary evolution.
And Marvin Margolis via cryptography and a direct personal relationship with the victim.
The detail in both of these theories is fascinating, but we simply cannot ignore the fundamental brutal conflict between the crimes themselves. It's the elephant in the room. The gap isn't just 20 years, it's the difference between a high-control clinical operation and a highly chaotic spectacle.
That gap in modus operandi, the killer's chosen method, is the single greatest piece of evidence against the unified killer theory. We need to contrast them sharply.
Let's do it.
The Black Dahlia murder was marked by surgical precision. The killer controlled the scene, the body was drained of blood, cleaned, precisely cut, and then staged. It was a single victim, likely held and murdered in a secluded location. The violence was focused, clinical, and intended to display anatomical knowledge.
Now, contrast that with the Zodiac attacks that started in 1968.
The Zodiac was chaotic, he was mobile, and he used different means of violence depending on the situation. His initial confirmed attacks, like the murders of Betty Lou Jensen and David Arthur Faraday, involved shooting couples in these isolated lovers' lanes.
He used guns, sometimes with a silencer.
Right. Then he shifted methodology entirely, moving to the notorious Lake Berryessa attack.
The Lake Berryessa attack, targeting Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell, is maybe the ultimate example of the Zodiac's theatrical approach.
It was his most complete performance. He didn't use surgical precision. He used excessive force, stabbing Cecilia Shepard 24 times. And, critically, he approached the couple wearing a theatrical costume.
A black hooded executioner's outfit with the crosshair symbol over the face?
Exactly. And he scrawled a message on the car door, linking himself to his previous crimes. This is not the cold, detached surgical act of 1947. This is spectacle, performance, and immediate frenzied rage.
It's the difference between a forensic pathology case, conducted almost in laboratory conditions, and a media circus where the killer is actively managing his own notoriety right there on the scene.
The change in psychological fulfillment is profound, and the communications reflect this shift too. The Zodiac's letters explicitly stated his motivation was hedonistic. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl.
And he claimed his victims would become his slaves in paradise.
So the focus is on accumulation, pleasure, and this fantasy-driven power complex.
Whereas the 1940s Black Dahlia Avenger notes suggested a completely different emotional drive.
Those notes suggested the killing was justified, that it was done for divine retribution. It implies a moralistic, hate-driven objective against women who, in the killer's mind, were deviant.
So you go from moral judgment and detached clinical procedure to theatrical, intense, almost playful violence focused on pleasure and collection.
It's a huge shift.
The skeptics are very clear on this. One of the quotes is, "The Zodiac Killer shot couples. The person who killed Elizabeth Short cut her in half and drained her blood. Hardly similar." It's just hard to reconcile a killer who maintains that level of control for the first crime and then completely loses it for the second.
Unless
What?
the 2 decades fundamentally changed his psychological makeup. Or maybe the methods were just different ways of satisfying the same core need for control and notoriety.
How do you mean?
Well, maybe the killer realized the surrealist art imitation of 1947 was too subtle for the general public. And 20 years later, in the age of televised news and mass communication, he needed a louder, more explicit way to manage his narrative. He went from high art to pulp fiction.
That's a fascinating reframing. The same psychological need, but a radically different approach to delivery dictated by cultural shifts over 20 years.
And we have to briefly acknowledge the cultural reality that feeds these theories. We keep revisiting these impossible puzzles because these cases, especially those involving iconic victims like Elizabeth Short, they become immortalized.
Right. Elizabeth Short became abstracted into a concept, the Black Dahlia, a cultural icon. And the true crime audience, we need closure, so we often create this cult of the female star, perpetually seeking a unified, satisfying answer, even if the evidence relies on huge circumstantial leaps.
The sheer complexity of Short's murder guarantees that someone will always try to link it to the next great unsolved crime. The intellectual effort required by both the Hodel and Margolis theories, employing art history and cryptography, shows just how deeply the public and investigators need a single explanation.
So as we conclude this deep dive, we're left standing on a very narrow bridge across 2 decades of darkness. Both George Hodel and Marvin Margolis offer incredibly detailed, if conflicting, narratives that attempt to solve 2 of America's most famous cold cases at the same time.
What remains undeniable is the clinical complexity of the Elizabeth Short murder. It was methodical, organized, and almost certainly part of a serial pattern in the 1940s, as identified by the LAPD's own 11 points of similarity.
And then 20 years later, the Zodiac was the calculated, theatrical, and prolific mastermind of ciphers and terror. Hodel's theory hinges on an evolution from surgical art mimicry to literary mimicry.
While Margolis's theory leans so heavily on the Z13 cipher being cracked using the keyword Elizabeth, confirming a hidden personal link.
The difference in the actual acts of violence is the main obstacle.
It is, but the evidence of a shared interest in highly intellectual games, whether it's surrealist art or advanced wartime cryptography, that suggests a killer who needed to demonstrate superior intelligence and perform his violence for an audience, often using media or hidden codes as his canvas.
I think the biggest takeaway here is the organizational capability implied by these intellectual connections. The Zodiac Killer, as demonstrated in his letters, explicitly used complex mathematics. He referred to radians in his correspondence.
And constructed a geometric pattern based on Mount Diablo.
That radians clue is crucial. Radians are a highly specific unit of angular measure. It's not common knowledge for the average person. The Zodiac was not just showing off general intelligence, he was demonstrating a specialized technical education.
He was trying to mathematically prove his authorship and genius by mapping his crimes geographically around Mount Diablo using these specific angles.
So if the solution to the Z13 cipher, one of the killer's most intimate cryptographic confessions, truly relies on the key word Elizabeth, linking him back to the 1947 victim.
And if the killer was using specialized mathematics like radians in the 60s,
then what other mathematical or geometric connections are hidden in the meticulous presentation of the Black Dahlia case itself that we've entirely overlooked?
the surgical bisection, the pose display, the exact measurements of the cuts, was the killer, whether it was Hodel or Margolis, starting a decades-long masterpiece defined not just by art or literature, but by a hidden geometric or mathematical code that we have yet to fully understand. The quest for that perfect, unifying pattern, it continues to define the mystery.